So now that we've talked about why we speak to inform, as well as talked about some tips that I have for you for informative speaking, I want to talk about the types of informative speeches that you can give. Now, there's a little asterisk at the top of this slide because ultimately it's not really important for your speeches to know which type of informative speech you're giving. So, for example, if you're giving a speech about the life of J.K. Rowling, you don't need to tell us, the audience, that this is an object speech, right? So the real goal here is to help you to come up with the topics for your informative speeches, right? These are supposed to be inspiration points, and they also might be important for the quizzes. So really just utilize these different categories of informative speeches to help you come up with your own speech topic. So let's talk about these different types of informative speeches. The first of these is the object speech. Now, we in the speech world tend to think of objects in a very different way from the way that normal people think of objects. When normal people think of objects, they think of inanimate objects, right? Like computers or calendars, pens, desks, those sorts of things. But instead, we think of objects in the speech world as anything that you can touch, right? Anything that's tangible. So if you can reach out and touch it and it's real, then it's an object speech. It can also be thought of as kind of a noun speech, people, places, things, those sorts of things. And so your object speech can be about a person, it can be about an institution, a place, a substance, or an inanimate object. So, for example, you could give a speech about the life and or achievements of J.K. Rowling, the Harry Potter author, and that would be an object speech, technically, right? Because it is about a person. You could also give a speech about an institution, like the school that you're at, for example. You could talk about the history of that school, or maybe some of the big historical moments that came out of your institution. You could also talk about places in general. So you could talk about something as specific as the Taj Mahal and the history behind that building and its importance. Or you could talk about why Hawaii is such a great place to go on vacation. You could also talk about substances. So, for example, you could talk about how THC is such a great medical advancement, right? How it's so useful in a lot of medical instances. And you could also talk about like LSD, right? Lots of sort of things that you could talk about there and the history of that drug, for example. So anything that's substantive, right, that you can touch. And finally, you could talk about inanimate objects, for example. So you could talk about the history of the MacBook computer, or you could talk about any other sort of inanimate object that you could possibly think of, and that would technically be an object speech. One of the examples that your textbook gives you is soy ink. And so you could give an informative speech about soy ink and inform your audience about the role of soy inks in reducing toxic pollution. So there's some pretty interesting stuff that can come out of object speech if you really just kind of let your brain go and think about what it is that you want to talk about. Underneath this idea of object speech, right, we have people speeches. And I wanted to talk about this separately because you could talk about specific people in an informative speech, like J.K. Rowling or like Buzz Aldrin, the astronaut, right, for example. But you could also talk about roles that people can play. So, for example, you could just give a speech about astronauts in general and have the specific purpose to inform your audience about the training programs that are undergone by the first U.S. astronauts to land on the moon. So that would be an example of a people speech, right? Because you're talking about astronauts in general. You're talking about roles that people can play. So that can be a type of informative speech that you give as well. You could also talk about events. And events are anything that has occurred once, or it can even be an event that is repeated. So, for example, you could talk about an event that occurred once. So you could talk about like Woodstock, for example, or you could talk about the Kristallnacht, which was the first night of World War II, where the German soldiers came and invaded Poland and broke all the storefronts. There was glass everywhere, you know, it was called the Kristallnacht, the night of broken glass. So you could talk about that event and how that kind of was the catalyst for the entirety of World War II. So that would be an event that occurred once, but you could also do events that are repeated. So for example, I talked about Woodstock earlier. You could talk about other music festivals that are currently still happening. So you could talk about Coachella, for example, and the culture that occurs at Coachella. You could also talk about, similarly, Burning Man, right? There's lots of different events that happen nowadays that you could talk about. And this could apply to like religious holidays as well. So you could talk about the history of Christmas or the history of Hanukkah or anything of that nature. That would technically be an event speech. You could also give a speech about a concept, and this is a much more abstract type of informative speech because you are looking at abstract ideas that exist whether or not they've been observed or practiced. So, for example, you could give a speech about whether or not aliens exist, and you would give evidence as to whether aliens do exist, and you would give the evidence of saying why they don't exist, and you would kind of compare and contrast the two and let the audience decide, right? That would be a concept speech. It's anything that's kind of hypothesized, that is an idea, right? So another example of this is the idea of ethnocentrism, and you could explain why people in all cultures are ethnocentric to a point. And that would be a concept speech, right? Because it's much more cognitive. It's in our heads more than it is a tangible thing that we could see or celebrate, right? And finally, we can give a speech about a process. And your goal, if you are giving a process speech, is to help your audience either understand the process that you are describing or be able to perform it. So in an earlier video, I gave the example of learning how to change a tire or giving a speech about how to change a tire. And so you could give a process speech about this. And your goal by the end of that speech would be that your audience could then go out and potentially change a tire with the information that you gave them and not have the car like come crashing down on them and all that kind of stuff. So you could give a process speech. You could also talk about it's basically like anything that's step by step. So you could talk about how to bake a cake or how to bake cookies, and you would tell people that you have to mix all the wet ingredients first, the butters and the sugars and all of that, and then you mix the dry ingredients, the flour and the salt, and you put them together and bake it for 350 degrees for 30 minutes or whatever it is, and they would be able to then go out and bake a cake or bake cookies after they heard your speech. Now, of course, the examples that I gave here are probably a little bit too simplistic for most audiences, so you're going to have to think outside the box. But these 5 categories of informative speeches hopefully can give you some inspiration as to what you could potentially talk about in your speeches.